Imagine waking up one morning to find a group of strangers standing in your backyard, claiming it now belongs to them. Sounds crazy, right? Well, that's exactly what happened to me when our HOA's self-proclaimed queen, Karen, decided she owned my property. But here's the twist. She didn't just lose this battle, she lost everything. Her power, her home, and even her freedom. How? Stick around because this is the wildest HOA takedown you'll ever hear. And trust me, you won't believe how it ends. Hello beautiful people. Before we dive in, a small click from you can help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Hit that subscribe button and be part of the journey. Let's go. Karen was the type of person who believed rules only applied to everyone else. She walked through the neighborhood as if she owned every square inch of it, clutching a clipboard like it was a royal scepter. The self-proclaimed ruler of the HOA, she had a reputation for making people's lives miserable over the most ridiculous infractions. A flower pot slightly out of place? Violation. Grass one shade darker than the HOA-approved green? Fine. Someone had dared to park their car an inch over the driveway line? Immediate notice of non-compliance. For the longest time I had managed to avoid her wrath, mostly by keeping a low profile. My house was technically inside the HOA's jurisdiction, but there was one small detail Karen had failed to account for. My backyard was legally separate from the HOA's control. When I bought the house, I made sure of it. The paperwork was clear. The HOA had no say over what I did with my backyard. That was until Karen decided otherwise. One morning, I stepped out onto my deck with my coffee, enjoying the quiet, when I noticed movement near my fence. 3 people stood in my yard, walking around like real estate agents inspecting a new property. One of them was Karen. She had her usual smug expression, arms crossed as if she were making a very important decision. I walked over, half expecting some kind of explanation. Instead, Karen barely acknowledged me before waving toward the other 2 HOA members, instructing them to take notes. When she finally turned to me, she spoke with the authority of a queen addressing an unworthy peasant. We have decided that this space would be better suited as a community garden. I blinked. Community what? She gave an exaggerated sigh, as if I were a child who just didn't understand the brilliance of her vision. The HOA has been looking for a way to beautify the neighborhood, and your backyard is the perfect location. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. It never came. That's funny because last I checked, this is my property. Karen's expression didn't change. Oh, but you see, we reviewed the HOA guidelines and I cut her off. And I reviewed my property deed. My backyard is not under HOA authority. For the first time, Karen hesitated. It was only a flicker of uncertainty, but it was there. Unfortunately, it didn't last. She plastered on her usual smirk and shrugged. Well, we'll see about that. With that, she and her cronies turned and walked off, leaving me standing there, completely dumbfounded. I wanted to believe that was the end of it. That she had realized her mistake and would let it go. But of course this was Karen. And Karen did not like being told no. That night I heard rustling outside. At first I thought it was an animal. But when I looked outside, my stomach dropped. Karen's goons were back, planting small flags in the ground. HOA flags. Like they were marking their territory. I stormed outside, flashlight in hand. What do you think you're doing? One of them, a man named Ted, looked startled, but Karen's influence was strong. He straightened up and cleared his throat. We're just marking the designated area for the new community garden. I shook my head in disbelief. You're trespassing on my property. Get out. Ted hesitated but eventually muttered something about checking with Karen before gathering the flags and leaving. I stood there for a long time after they were gone, trying to wrap my head around the insanity of it all. The next morning, I decided to get ahead of whatever ridiculous stunt Karen had planned next. I called the county office and asked about my property's legal standing. The response was exactly what I expected. My backyard was 100% mine. The HOA had no authority over it. But then the county official said something that caught my attention. It's interesting you're calling about this now. There have been some other issues related to Karen and the HOA lately. I leaned forward. What kind of issues? The official hesitated before choosing his words carefully. Let's just say you're not the first person to bring up questionable behavior on her part. There might be a bigger problem brewing. That was the moment I knew this was about to get a lot bigger than just my backyard. Later that day, Karen made her next move. I received a letter in the mail, stamped with the HOA logo, declaring that I was in violation of new community standards. The letter claimed my backyard was an eyesore and needed to be converted into the designated community garden space. If I didn't comply, I would be fined $500 per day. I actually laughed out loud reading it. She had nothing. No legal standing. No authority. But she still thought she could bully me into submission. I wasn't going to let that happen. I drafted my own letter, citing the legal records proving the HOA had no jurisdiction over my backyard. I also included a warning that any further attempts to trespass or make unauthorized changes to my property would result in legal action. I hand-delivered the letter to Karen's house. The second she opened the door and saw me, her expression turned to pure disdain. I smiled, handing over the envelope. "Thought you'd want to read this." She snatched it from my hand, glaring at me before slamming the door shut. I didn't hear from her again for a few days. It was quiet. Too quiet. And then I woke up one morning to a notification from my security cameras. Karen was in my backyard. This time she had a can of spray paint. I had dealt with my fair share of HOA nonsense before, but Karen had just taken things to an entirely new level. Waking up to a security notification, I tapped my phone screen to see what was going on, and there she was, Karen in my backyard at the crack of dawn, holding a can of spray paint like she was about to create her own twisted masterpiece. I shot out of bed and rushed outside, catching her mid-crime. She had already managed to scrawl the word violation across my fence in big angry red letters. She spun around at the sound of my footsteps, startled like a raccoon caught rummaging through trash. "What are you doing?" I demanded. Karen quickly composed herself, straightening her posture as if she still held the upper hand. "Oh, I'm just marking the problem areas," she said, waving the spray can dismissively. "This is a courtesy warning before the real fines start." "The real fines?" "Yes. As of this morning, your property is officially under HOA jurisdiction. The board voted and it's been decided." I stared at her, completely baffled. "The board voted? On what?" "You don't own my land." She smirked. "We'll see about that." Before I could respond, she tossed the spray can onto my lawn and walked away like she had just won a battle. I called the police. It was clear trespassing and vandalism, but when the officers arrived, Karen had already disappeared into her house. After explaining the situation, they agreed to file a report but told me they couldn't do much unless I pressed charges. I decided to hold off, for now. I wanted to see just how far Karen was willing to go. I didn't have to wait long. The very next day, an official-looking letter showed up in my mailbox. Another HOA violation notice. This time it claimed I owed $2,000 in unpaid fines. My crimes? Having an unregistered backyard, an unauthorized fence color, and, this one nearly made me choke on my coffee, owning a non-compliant tree. What exactly was a non-compliant tree? Apparently, my maple tree wasn't on the HOA's approved list of acceptable neighborhood foliage. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I decided to confront Karen directly. I marched over to her house and rang the doorbell. She opened the door just enough to glare at me through the crack. "What do you want?" she snapped. I held up the letter. "This is insane even for you." Karen crossed her arms, looking pleased with herself. "Rules are rules. If you want to be a part of this community, you need to follow them. I'm not a part of your community. You have no authority over my property." She let out a laugh. "Oh, but you see, I found a loophole. The HOA can claim control over properties that directly affect community aesthetics. Your backyard is visible from the walking path. That means it falls under HOA regulations now." I was stunned. That wasn't how property law worked. But Karen had never let facts get in her way before. I decided to play her game. That night, I went online and pulled every piece of legal documentation I could find about HOA boundaries and jurisdiction. Not only did I confirm once again that my backyard was outside of their control, but I also found something even more interesting. Karen had been making up rules as she went. And I wasn't the only one who had caught on. The next morning, I started knocking on doors. I talked to my neighbors, many of whom had been quietly suffering under Karen's reign for years. I found out that she had been issuing ridiculous fines left and right, but very few people had questioned them. She had threatened legal action against multiple homeowners, most of whom had just paid the fines out of fear. Then came the real bombshell. One of my neighbors, a retired accountant, had recently looked into the HOA's financial records. And there were inconsistencies. Thousands of dollars in community improvement funds had been funneled into unaccounted expenses. Suspicious payments had been made to companies that didn't seem to exist. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was happening. Karen was using the HOA as her personal piggy bank. Armed with this new information, I decided it was time to fight back. The first thing I did was send an official letter. This time not to Karen but to the entire HOA board. I detailed every violation of proper HOA conduct, every illegal fine, and every shady financial transaction I had uncovered. I made it clear that if this harassment didn't stop immediately, I would be taking legal action, not just against Karen but against the entire HOA. The response was immediate. I woke up the next morning to find Karen pacing in front of my house, phone in hand, frantically making calls. She looked like a woman whose world was crumbling, and for good reason. The HOA board had finally started to question her leadership. A few members even knocked on my door later that day to discuss the situation. They weren't happy. Karen must have sensed she was losing control, because that's when she escalated things to a whole new level. That night I was home watching TV when I heard loud noises coming from outside. I grabbed my phone and checked my security cameras. There she was again. Karen standing in my yard, this time with a shovel. I stormed outside. "What are you doing now?" Karen jumped, looking guilty for half a second before regaining her usual arrogance. "I'm preparing the ground for the community garden," she said, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "With a shovel? At 10 o'clock at night?" She huffed. "These things take time. I thought I'd get started early." That was it. I had given her enough warnings. I pulled out my phone and dialed the non-emergency police line right in front of her. "You're trespassing again, and now you're actively damaging my property." "I'm done playing games, Karen." For the first time, real fear crossed her face. She tried to argue, tried to insist that the HOA had given her permission, but I didn't let her get another word in. The officers arrived within 15 minutes. Karen tried to talk her way out of it, but the security footage didn't lie. They issued her a formal warning for trespassing and vandalism. It wasn't the arrest I had hoped for, but it was enough to rattle her. As the officers left, Karen turned to me, her face twisted in fury. "You don't know who you're messing with." I smiled. "Oh, I think I do." Karen stormed off, but I could tell this wasn't over yet. She wasn't going to back down quietly. And I had a feeling that her next move would be the most desperate one yet. Karen was losing control, and she knew it. The moment the police gave her that trespassing warning, something inside her snapped. It was written all over her face. Pure, unfiltered rage. She wasn't used to being challenged, and she certainly wasn't used to losing. For the next few days, the neighborhood was eerily quiet. No random fines. No HOA threats. Not a single ridiculous notice left on anyone's doorstep. It almost seemed like Karen had finally accepted defeat. Until the eviction notice arrived. I found it taped to my front door, printed on HOA letterhead, demanding that I vacate my property within 30 days due to repeated violations of community guidelines. I had to read it twice just to process how insane it was. Karen had officially lost her mind. I grabbed the letter and marched straight to her house. I didn't even bother knocking. I just held up the paper and waved it in her face the second she opened the door. "You have officially lost it," I said. Karen smirked. "Oh, I think you'll find this is perfectly legal. The board has voted to remove you from the neighborhood." I laughed. Actually laughed. That's not how any of this works. You can't evict someone from their own property. She crossed her arms. "That's not what my lawyer says." I raised an eyebrow. "Your lawyer?" "Yes. He's handling all legal matters from this point on. You'll be receiving official court documents soon." That was when I noticed the man standing behind her. He looked uncomfortable, like he wasn't entirely sure what he had just signed up for. I turned to him. "So you're the lawyer?" He hesitated before clearing his throat. "Well, not exactly. I'm still in the process of—" I cut him off. "Let me guess. You took an online legal course and watched a few courtroom dramas, and now Karen is paying you in HOA funds to play attorney?" His face turned red. Karen huffed. "It doesn't matter. You'll be out of here soon enough." I smiled. "Actually, Karen, I have some news for you. You might want to check your email." Her smirk faltered. I had already sent a formal complaint to the county's HOA Oversight Board, along with all the evidence I had collected. Karen's fake fines. The unauthorized trespassing. The financial discrepancies. the reports from multiple neighbors. And as of this morning, the county had officially launched an investigation into the HOA. Karen grabbed her phone and started furiously tapping on the screen. Her face went from red to pale in a matter of seconds. This is ridiculous, she sputtered. I tilted my head. Is it? Because it looks like they're requesting a full audit of the HOA's finances. You know, the ones you've been using to fund your vacations. Karen's eyes darted around like a trapped animal searching for an escape. That's when the HOA board showed up. 3 of them looking furious. Karen, we need to talk. She straightened her posture. I'm in the middle of something. No, you're done, one of them said. We just got a call from the county. You've been misusing HOA funds. There are missing transactions. Unauthorized expenses. Karen scoffed. Oh please. This is nothing but a misunderstanding. We also looked into those fines you issued, another board member said. Turns out half of them weren't even real violations. You've been making up rules as you go. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. That's when I decided to deliver the final blow. Oh, and just a heads up, Karen, I added. You might want to prepare for a visit. She blinked. A visit from who? Before I could answer, the sound of sirens filled the air. Karen turned just in time to see a police car pulling up in front of her house. She spun back to me. You called the police on me? No, I said. The county did. It turned out Karen had more than just HOA violations under her belt. When the county reviewed the financial discrepancies, they found something even bigger. Evidence of embezzlement. She had been skimming money from HOA dues for years, using it to fund personal expenses, including a second property in another city. And now it was all catching up to her. The officers stepped out of the car, walking straight toward her. Karen Smith? One of them said. She stepped back. This is a mistake. We need you to come with us, the officer continued. We have some questions about financial misconduct and fraudulent use of HOA funds. Karen shook her head furiously. You can't do this. I am the HO. The officers exchanged a glance before one of them pulled out a pair of handcuffs. No. You're under investigation. And just like that, the reign of Karen was over. The entire neighborhood watched as she was led to the squad car, ranting about how she was being framed. I hope you all know what you've done. She screamed. This community will fall apart without me. The door slammed shut. The car pulled away. And the entire neighborhood cheered. It didn't take long for the HOA to start picking up the pieces. The board held an emergency meeting and voted to remove Karen from the presidency. A new president was elected, a reasonable, level-headed neighbor who actually wanted to improve the community rather than control it. All of Karen's ridiculous fines were overturned. Every bogus violation she had issued was erased. And as for her house? Well, Karen had used HOA funds to pay for part of her mortgage. Once that was exposed, the county seized her property. Her house went up for auction. And the best part? It was bought by the one neighbor she hated the most. A guy named Greg who had been fined thousands of dollars by Karen for things like leaving his trash can out 5 minutes too long and using the wrong type of Christmas lights. Greg moved in and threw the biggest housewarming party the neighborhood had ever seen. As for Karen, last I heard she had left town in disgrace. Someone spotted her working at a small-town convenience store, still barking orders at customers like she was running a miniature HOA. But in our neighborhood, peace had finally been restored. No more ridiculous fines. No more late-night trespassing. Just a quiet, well-earned victory. And a backyard that still belonged to me. With Karen gone, the neighborhood felt lighter, as if an oppressive fog had finally lifted. No more ridiculous violation notices, no more random fines for breathing the wrong way, and no more late-night trespassing missions from an unhinged HOA president. For the first time in years, people actually felt comfortable living in their own homes. But the fallout from Karen's reign of terror was far from over. The damage she had done to the HOA was deeper than anyone had realized. A week after her arrest, an official audit of the HOA's finances was completed. The results? A financial disaster. Karen had drained nearly $100,000 from the HOA's accounts over the years, funneling the money into personal expenses. Lavish spa days, unnecessary business trips, even a shady landscaping project that had mysteriously cost triple the expected amount, which made sense when it was discovered that the landscaper was her cousin. But the biggest shocker? She had been secretly paying herself a salary, a job that was supposed to be voluntary. When the HOA board revealed the full extent of the fraud, the community was livid. Residents who had been bullied into paying bogus fines demanded refunds, and several homeowners threatened lawsuits against the HOA itself for allowing Karen's corruption to go unchecked. The county officially banned Karen from holding any future HOA positions, not just in our neighborhood but anywhere. She was blacklisted. No HOA would ever take her again. The new HOA board, led by our newly elected and much more reasonable president, started the painful process of fixing the mess. Most of Karen's outrageous rules were immediately overturned, including the ban on certain flowers, the approved lawn color chart, and the absurd requirement that trash cans be hidden from view at all times, even on trash day. It turned out, without Karen's oppressive rule, the neighborhood didn't fall into chaos like she had always warned. Actually thrived. People started chatting with their neighbors more, relaxed knowing that they weren't being watched like criminals. Families who had been too afraid to decorate their houses for the holidays went all out. Even Greg, the neighbor who bought Karen's house, went overboard, installing the biggest, flashiest Christmas light display ever seen, just because he could. Speaking of Karen's house, watching Greg move in was poetic justice at its finest. Karen had spent years making his life miserable, fining him over every minor detail she could think of. She once charged him $500 because his welcome mat was too large, and another $750 for parking his car at an unapproved angle. Now Greg owned the very house she had been ruling from. To make things even sweeter, he made a few modifications. The first thing he did was repaint it bright yellow, a direct violation of the color codes Karen had forced onto the neighborhood. Then he installed a massive inflatable flamingo on the front lawn, knowing full well that Karen had personally banned all lawn ornaments. And then, the cherry on top, Greg threw a massive housewarming party and invited the entire neighborhood. Everyone showed up. Music blasted, people laughed, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a real community again. But what about Karen? Once she was officially removed from the HOA, she vanished. At first, people thought she had skipped town completely, too embarrassed to show her face again. But then someone spotted her working at a gas station 2 towns over. Apparently she had lost everything: her house, her position of power, even the money she had stolen. She had been forced to take a minimum wage job to stay afloat. And, in true Karen fashion, she was still trying to enforce rules on people who didn't care. One former neighbor who happened to stop by the gas station overheard her lecturing a customer. "Sir, you can't wear flip-flops in here. It's against policy." The customer stared at her, confused. "Lady, I'm just here to get gas." The best part? The gas station didn't even have a rule against flip-flops. Karen had just invented it because some habits die hard. It was almost sad. Almost. As for me, life was better than ever. My backyard was still mine, untouched by HOA nonsense. The new board even formally apologized for Karen's behavior and confirmed, in writing, that my land was completely outside their jurisdiction. I threw a celebratory barbecue that summer, inviting all the neighbors who had suffered under Karen's rule. We laughed, shared horror stories about past HOA nonsense, and toasted to the end of an era. No more fines. No more ridiculous rules. And best of all, no more Karen. The neighborhood had finally been freed.